Everyone laughed when the widow adopted the broken stallion. Then, the neighbors heard the scream. The scream came from behind the fence line, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that crowd could tell if it belonged to the woman or the horse. A truck engine backfired somewhere near the barn. 1,700 pounds of black Friesian reared against a gray October sky, and a 62-year-old woman in a canvas coat walked directly into the space where his hooves would land. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody could. What happened in the next 4 seconds would be talked about in that county for years, retold at diners and church socials and veterinary conferences, always ending the same way, with someone shaking their head and saying they still don't know how she knew. Before any of that, though, there was a laugh. A cruel, easy laugh that rippled through an auction yard on a cold morning in early September, when a widow raised her hand and paid $4,000 for an animal that everyone else in the room had already decided was worthless. This is the story of what she saw that they didn't. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who believes broken things still have a heartbeat worth listening for, drop a comment with the name of your town. I want to know how far this story is traveling tonight. Hit like if you've ever loved something the world had already given up on, and subscribe if you want to keep finding stories like this one. Now, let's go back to that auction yard, 3 weeks before the scream. The town of Aldermont Hollow sat in a fold of the Berkshire foothills where the frost came early and stayed late, where the soil remembered every family that had ever tried to farm it and forgave almost none of them. It was the kind of place where a person's worth got measured in bushels and board feet, in how straight a fence line ran, and whether the barn roof held through a bad winter. Sentiment did not pay the property tax. Aldermont Hollow had never asked it to. Muriel Ashworth had lived on the eastern ridge of that valley for 31 years, in a farmhouse with a wraparound porch that her husband Thomas had built with his own hands the summer before their wedding. The orchard behind the house had once produced 11 varieties of apple, shipped in crates stamped with the family name to markets 3 counties over. Now it produced mostly silence. Rows of trees stood untended, their branches gone wild and tangled, because Thomas had been the one who understood grafting and pruning and the language of fruit trees, and Thomas had been gone for 2 years. He died on a Tuesday in March, on the tractor path behind the north field, his heart stopping so suddenly that the machine kept idling for 20 minutes after he slumped sideways in the seat. Muriel found him when the sound of the engine finally became strange to her, a low, steady drone that shouldn't have lasted that long. She did not scream that day. She walked to the tractor, turned the key, and sat down in the frost-stiff grass beside her husband's body until the volunteer fire department arrived 40 minutes later. Nobody in Aldermont Hollow had heard her raise her voice since. The farmhouse still had his boots by the back door. His reading glasses still sat folded on the nightstand, as though he might come in from the fields any minute and need them. Muriel moved through her days with the economy of someone conserving a resource she wasn't sure she had left. She fed the chickens. She patched the fence when it needed patching. She drove into town on Thursdays for groceries and nothing else. And she answered when spoken to. And she did not linger in anyone's company long enough for pity to find a foothold. The neighbors had opinions about this, the way neighbors in small places always do. Some called it grief that hadn't finished its work. Others, more bluntly, called it a woman going quiet in the head, out there alone with an orchard she couldn't keep up and a house too big for one person's footsteps. Lyle Corrigan, who owned the 400 acres bordering hers to the west, had made no secret of which opinion he held. Lyle had built his cattle operation into the largest in the valley through a combination of genuine skill and an appetite for other people's land that most of the county had learned to work around. He'd made Muriel 2 offers on the orchard property since Thomas's funeral, both low, both delivered with the particular gentleness men use when they think a woman is too fragile to notice she's being taken advantage of. Both times, she'd said no without raising her eyes from whatever her hands were doing. Lyle had not stopped smiling either time, but something behind the smile had started keeping a tally. It was Lyle, in fact, who mentioned the auction to her, though not out of kindness. He'd stopped his truck at the end of her drive on a warm September afternoon, engine running, elbow out the window, the posture of a man who considered every conversation an inspection. There's a livestock sale Saturday, over in Brindle Creek. Cattle mostly. Might do you good to get off this hill for an afternoon. She'd said nothing, only nodded once, the way she nodded at most things now. A gesture that could mean agreement or could mean she simply wanted him to finish talking and drive away. He'd driven away. She had gone to the auction anyway, not for cattle, and not because he'd suggested it, but because Thomas used to go every fall, and some old current in her still moved toward the calendar dates he used to keep. The Brindle Creek auction yard was a low cinder block building with a dirt arena at its center, ringed by bleachers that smelled of diesel and wet hay. Muriel arrived an hour into the sale, slid into a seat near the back, and watched cattle move through the ring in bored, orderly procession. Heifers, a few dairy cows past their prime, a scattering of goats that went for almost nothing. She had no intention of bidding on anything. She told herself this twice. Then, near the end of the day, when half the crowd had already drifted toward the parking lot, a side gate opened and something came through it that made the remaining onlookers sit up straighter. He was enormous. A Friesian stallion, coat black as wet slate, mane and tail matted with burrs and neglect, but unmistakably, achingly beautiful beneath the ruin of it. He came through the gate at a violent trot, ears pinned, eyes rolling white at the edges, and the two handlers flanking him kept their bodies angled away like men used to being kicked. A murmur went through the bleachers. Someone near Muriel laughed, not a kind laugh, the kind reserved for a joke everyone already understands. The auctioneer's assistant read from a clipboard in a flat, dismissive voice. Age approximately 14. Temperament unmanageable. Sold as is, no guarantees, no returns. Buyer assumes all liability. There was a pause, and then, almost as an afterthought, called broken by his previous owner. For obvious reasons. The stallion spun in a tight, furious circle, throwing his head, and the crowd laughed again, louder this time. The laughter of people watching something confirm exactly what they'd expected to see. A few called out bids on principle. Meat prices, someone muttered, low numbers meant for a body rather than a life. The bidding limped along at a humiliating pace. Muriel sat very still. She was watching his left side. Every time the handler approached from that direction, the horse's panic sharpened into something closer to terror, a full-body flinch that came a half-second before contact, as though he were bracing for a blow that hadn't been thrown. From the right, he startled but recovered. From the left, he came apart. Nobody else in the bleachers seemed to notice the difference. Nobody else was looking for it. The bid stood at $300, a number reserved for animals headed to slaughter, when Muriel Ashworth raised her hand. The auctioneer paused mid-chant, genuinely startled, and asked her to confirm. She nodded. The bidding, which had been dead a moment before, sparked back to life out of pure disbelief. A ranch or two rose down, more amused than serious, called an increase just to see what she'd do. She matched it. He raised again. She matched it again, her face giving away nothing, her hand steady each time it went up. By the time the hammer fell, the number was $4,000. Every remaining cent Muriel had set aside for the winter, for the roof repair the farmhouse desperately needed, for the property taxes due in November. The auction yard had gone quiet in a different way now. The laughter curdled into something more like disbelief. And somewhere in that hush, while Corrigan's name moved through the crowd in a whisper, because word had already reached him by the time she pulled her truck and trailer up to the loading chute. Word that the widow on the ridge had just spent her whole winter's savings on a horse nobody could touch. Getting the stallion into the trailer took 90 minutes and cost Muriel a bruise along her forearm the size of a plum. The handlers refused to approach him a second time, citing insurance, citing common sense, citing the plain fact that the horse had already put one man against a fence rail hard enough to crack 2 ribs earlier that summer. In the end, it was Muriel alone in the loading chute, speaking to him in a voice so low the men standing 20 feet away couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm of them, steady as water finding the shape of a stone. She did not approach from his blind side. She would not have been able to name why, not yet, only that some instinct older than reasoning kept her moving along his right shoulder, palm open, weight low. It took him a long time to stop shaking. It took him longer to step up into the trailer. But he did, eventually, and the sound the ramp made when it closed behind him was the loudest thing in that whole gray afternoon. The drive home took 40 minutes on roads that hadn't been repaved since Thomas was alive, and every pothole sent a shudder of hooves against metal that made Muriel's hands tighten on the wheel. She did not turn on the radio. She drove with the windows cracked so she could hear him, and somewhere around the halfway point the frantic kicking eased into something closer to restless pacing. For steps and a stop, for steps and a stop, the sound of an animal running out of a fight nobody was offering. Word reached the ridge before she did. By the time her truck turned up the long gravel drive, two of her nearest neighbors, the Fenwick brothers, who ran a modest dairy a mile south, were already standing at her fence line, having heard from a cousin who'd been at the sale. They watched her back the trailer toward the old round pen behind the barn, a structure Thomas had built for breaking colts decades ago, and that hadn't held an animal in 6 years. The younger Fenwick, Daniel, called out as she climbed down from the cab. "That the horse from Brindle Creek? The one that broke Hollis Monroe's ribs?" Muriel didn't answer directly. She only said that she'd need help getting the ramp latch open, and something in her flat, unbothered tone made both brothers go quiet and lend their hands instead of their opinions. It was the last help she'd accept from any neighbor for a long while. The unloading was worse than the loading. The Stallion came off the ramp in a full, wild bolt, and it was only the round pen's height, 8 feet of solid rail Thomas had built to withstand exactly this kind of panic, that kept him contained. He hit the far rail once, hard enough that the whole structure groaned, and then he stood in the center of the pen, sides heaving, legs splayed, an animal expecting the next blow to come from any direction at any moment. The Fenwick brothers left within the hour, murmuring to each other in the tone people use when they've just watched someone make a decision they're certain will end badly. Muriel didn't walk them to their truck. She stood at the pen rail, arms crossed over the top board, and watched the horse breathe. That night, she did not sleep in the house. She carried a folding chair and a wool blanket out to the barn and set herself up 10 feet from the round pen, on the outside of the rail, close enough to be a presence and far enough to be no threat. The Stallion watched her from the far side of the enclosure for hours, ears swiveling, weight shifting from hoof to hoof, never once lying down. Around midnight, without entirely deciding to, Muriel reached into the canvas bag she'd brought and pulled out a small leather-bound book, its spine cracked from years of handling. It was one of Thomas's journals. He'd kept dozens of them over the decades, mostly notes on grafting schedules and weather patterns and orchard yields, but tucked between the practical entries were other things, small observations, private thoughts, the kind of writing a man does for no one but himself, and, later, for whoever finds the book after he's gone. Muriel had not opened one of these journals since the funeral. She wasn't sure, later, what made her open one that night, in a cold barn, beside a terrified animal that had nearly killed a man. She began to read aloud. Not loudly, just enough for the sound to carry the 10 feet between them. A low, even murmur about apple blight in the summer of 1998 and a hard frost that took the gala trees before harvest. The Stallion's ears turned toward her voice. He did not stop pacing, not that first night, but the pacing slowed, the 4 steps and a stop rhythm stretching into 6 steps, then 8. As though her voice were a metronome, he was reluctantly matching. By the time the sky over the eastern ridge went the color of a healing bruise, Muriel had read through 11 pages and fallen asleep in the folding chair, the journal still open in her lap. When Daniel Fenwick drove past at dawn on his way to the dairy, he slowed his truck at the sight of her there, asleep at the fence of an animal that had put a grown man in the hospital, and did not know what to make of what he saw, except that it did not look like the reckless foolishness he'd expected. It looked, he would say later to his brother, like something closer to a vigil. The Stallion, for his part, had finally lain down sometime before sunrise. Not near her, not yet, but down, in the far corner of the pen, his great dark body folded into the straw, watching her sleeping shape through the rails with an attention that had, for the first time and longer than anyone could say, stopped looking like fear. The days that followed took on a shape that would have been unrecognizable to Muriel a month earlier. She rose before light, carried coffee and a journal out to the round pen, and read. She did not attempt to touch the horse. She did not carry rope or halter or any of the tools a person might expect a woman to bring to an animal she'd paid $4,000 to tame. She simply sat and read and let the hours pass in the company of a creature that had, by every account she'd heard, no capacity for company at all. On the 4th morning, she found the leather halter. It had come with the horse, tangled and forgotten at the bottom of the trailer's tack box, stiff with age and stained dark along the crownpiece. She almost threw it out, It was cracked, unusable, the kind of thing that gets discarded without a second look. But as she turned it over in her hands, sunlight caught a series of letters burned crudely into the underside of the leather, half worn away by decades of sweat and handling. She had to angle it 3 different ways before the shapes resolved into a name. Zephyr. Not broken, not the flat, contemptuous label some previous owner had hung on him like a verdict. A name someone had once chosen with care, burned into leather meant to last. Muriel sat with that halter in her lap for a long time before she carried it back out to the pen, and that evening, for the first time, she spoke the name aloud instead of reading from the journal. Just the one word, quiet, testing the shape of it in the cold air. The horse's head came up sharply. His ears swiveled forward, full attention, an intensity that hadn't shown itself in 4 days of pacing and flinching. It was, she would understand only much later, the first time in years that anyone had called him by the name he actually knew. Progress, once it started, moved in small, deniable increments. The kind that would mean nothing to a bystander watching from the road, but meant everything to a woman keeping silent count. On the 6th day, the stallion stopped pacing when she arrived and instead stood facing her, still 10 feet distant, but still and watching. On the 8th day, he took 2 steps toward the rail before catching himself and retreating. On the 11th day, while she was reading a passage about the year Thomas had grafted a northern spy scion onto rootstock that everyone told him wouldn't take, Zephyr crossed the entire width of the pen and lowered his great head until his forehead rested against the top rail, a foot from her shoulder. Muriel did not move. She did not reach for him. She kept reading, her voice steadier than it had sounded in 2 years, and let the horse decide, on his own terms and in his own time, exactly how close he wanted to come. Word of this arrangement spread through Aldermont Hollow the way most things did, slowly at first, then all at once, carried on the backs of grocery store conversations and church parking lot gossip. Some of it was kind, in the distant, bemused way people are kind about things they don't understand. Most of it was not. The story that circulated fastest was the one that painted Muriel as a grieving woman losing her grip, spending her husband's memory and her last dollars on a lost cause, reading bedtime stories to an animal that had already proven itself a danger to the whole valley, while Corrigan heard every version and made sure to repeat the least flattering ones. He drove up her gravel drive twice in the following 2 weeks, always under the pretense of neighborly concern, always managing to mention, somewhere in the conversation, the falling apple prices, the cost of feed, the difficulty a woman alone would have covering vet bills for an animal that size. On his second visit, he stood at the round pen fence and studied Zephyr with the flat, appraising look of a man pricing livestock, and said, loud enough to be heard inside the barn, that it was a shame to see good land go to waste on sentiment. Muriel, mucking out a stall 20 feet away, did not look up. She had learned, in 2 years of widowhood, that silence cost her less than arguing ever had. But Lau was not a man accustomed to silence working against him, and the visits stopped being casual. On the 15th day, a white truck bearing the county seal turned up Muriel's drive, and a man in a khaki uniform climbed out carrying a clipboard and an expression of practiced neutrality. He introduced himself as Warren Pettibone, the county's animal control officer, and explained, in the careful language of someone reading from a script, that a formal complaint had been filed regarding a dangerous animal being kept in insufficient containment near a shared property line. Muriel's hands went still on the pitchfork handle. The complaint, Warren explained, cited concerns for public safety, a history of documented aggression, an untrained and possibly unsound temperament, proximity to neighboring livestock and children who sometimes visited the Fenwick dairy down the road. He did not say Lyle's name. He did not need to. The complaint form, which he showed her without quite meaning to, bore a signature she recognized immediately, the same looping, self-satisfied hand that had signed both of the purchase offers she'd already refused. Warren was, by all appearances, not an unkind man, and something in his posture suggested he found the whole situation distasteful even as he was obligated to carry it out. He explained that the county would require a formal evaluation, a public temperament and handling test, conducted at her property, with a licensed evaluator present, to determine whether the animal could remain in her custody or whether it would need to be surrendered for humane disposition. The test was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Enough time, Warren said, not unkindly, for her to reconsider whether this was a fight worth having. Muriel asked him only one question before he left. She asked what would happen to the horse if she failed the test. Warren's silence lasted a beat too long before he answered, and his answer was the kind that didn't need many words to land with its full weight. She stood at the end of her drive long after his truck had disappeared around the bend, the pitchfork still in her hand, the cold afternoon light draining slowly out of the sky, and for the first time since the auction, something that looked almost like fear moved across her face. The 3 weeks that followed were the hardest of Muriel's life since the spring Thomas died, and there were moments, alone in the dark of the farmhouse kitchen, when the two griefs seemed to blur together into a single unbearable weight. She threw herself into what training she could manage without rope or force, understanding on some deep, wordless level that anything resembling coercion would undo everything the past weeks had built. She spent hours simply standing near Zephyr, letting him grow accustomed to the shape of her presence at different distances, different angles, different times of day. She began, cautiously, to run a soft brush along his neck and shoulder, always from the right side, always slow, always retreating the instant his body tensed. It was on one of these mornings, brushing along the ridge of his neck, that she noticed the discharge crusted along the edge of his left ear, and the way he never quite turned that ear toward any sound, no matter how sharp or sudden. She called the county veterinarian the following day, a woman named Priya Anand who came recommended by nobody in particular and who arrived with the brisk, unbothered competence of someone who had handled far worse animals than a nervous Friesian. Dr. Anand's examination, conducted with a patience Muriel hadn't expected from a stranger, confirmed what days of quiet observation had already suggested. Zephyr was completely deaf in his left ear. The result, the vet explained, of a severe, long untreated ear infection, likely from years earlier, that had caused permanent nerve damage. The scarring inside the canal told a story of prolonged neglect, possibly even active mistreatment, an animal left to suffer through an infection that any competent owner would have caught and treated in days. It changed everything and it changed nothing, both at once. It explained the panic, the violence, the reputation that had followed him from farm to farm. A horse who could not hear anyone or anything approaching from one entire side of his body, who had likely spent years being struck, grabbed, and startled from his blind spot by people who mistook deafness for madness, and who had learned, the only way a horse can learn, to strike first and ask no questions. It did not, however, change the fact that in 18 days, Zephyr would be led into an open field in front of the entire township and asked to perform calmly under exactly the kind of unpredictable conditions that had broken him. Dr. Anand was honest about the odds. A deaf horse could absolutely be trained, could absolutely be safe, could absolutely live a long and useful life, but not on the county's timeline, and not under the pressure of an audience assembled specifically to watch him fail. She offered, gently, to write a letter explaining the diagnosis to the evaluation board, hoping it might buy more time. Muriel thanked her, and did not tell her that a letter alone would almost certainly not be enough, not against a man like Lal Corrigan, who had already begun making sure the whole valley understood the test not as a formality, but as a verdict on a foolish old woman who thought love could fix what training couldn't. The gossip sharpened as the test date approached. Muriel heard fragments of it every Thursday at the grocery store, voices lowering just enough to seem discreet, just loud enough to be heard. Poor things finally cracked. That horse is going to kill somebody before it's over. Somebody ought to have stepped in sooner. She kept her chin level and her cart moving and said nothing. Though each overheard sentence lodged somewhere under her ribs like a splinter she couldn't reach. At home, in the evenings, she read to Zephyr from a different journal now, one from the last year of Thomas's life, when his handwriting had begun to loosen and slant with the tremor that eventually took him. She read about the two of them, young and half-broke themselves, buying this land with nothing but a truck and a mortgage and more stubbornness than sense. She read about the year the orchard nearly failed and they ate potatoes for 3 months to make the payment. She read about a marriage built, patiently, out of two people who kept showing up for each other on the hard mornings as much as the easy ones. Somewhere in those readings, without either of them announcing it, something shifted permanently between the woman and the horse. He began meeting her at the gate each morning instead of waiting to be approached. He allowed her to run a hand down his blindside shoulder, so long as she moved into his field of vision first, and let him track her the whole way there. Twice, she found him standing with his head low and his eyes half closed while she read, an unmistakable posture of rest, of surrender, of an animal who had decided, against every instinct his body had spent years reinforcing, to stop bracing for the next blow. It was on the 16th day, 2 days before the evaluation, that Lyle Corrigan appeared at her fence line one final time, and the conversation that followed would be the one Muriel remembered most vividly for the rest of her life. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He stood with his forearms on the top rail, watching Zephyr graze at the far end of the pen, and said, in the tone of a man delivering a kindness he expected to be thanked for, that she should sell him the West 40 now, before the evaluation, before the county forced her hand, and she ended up with nothing at all. He said the words, a business decision, and a woman alone shouldn't have to carry this. And I'm only trying to help you see reason, all delivered with the practiced warmth of someone who had convinced himself, somewhere along the way, that greed and generosity were the same thing if you said them softly enough. Muriel let the silence stretch long enough to become its own answer. Then she said, without raising her voice, that Thomas built this fence with his own hands, and she'd be along it, one board at a time, before she'd hand a single acre to a man who called an animal broken because it was inconvenient to understand him. Lyle's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, the particular stillness of a man recalculating. He said, as he turned back toward his truck, that he'd see her Saturday, and that he hoped, for her sake, the horse behaved itself in front of the whole town. It was less a farewell than a promise, and Muriel understood it as exactly that. By Friday evening, the news had traveled to every corner of Aldermont Hollow that Saturday's evaluation would not be a quiet, private affair. Someone, likely Lyle, though it could never be proven, had mentioned it at the feed store, at the diner, at the gas pumps, framing it less as a county procedure and more as a spectacle worth witnessing. By the time Muriel drove into town Friday afternoon for last-minute supplies, she could feel the shift in how people looked at her, the particular quality of attention reserved for someone about to become a story. She spent that final night the way she'd spent every night for the past 3 weeks, in the folding chair outside the round pen, reading aloud until her voice went hoarse. But this night, for the first time, she set the journal aside before finishing the chapter and simply sat with her palm flat against Zephyr's lowered forehead, the two of them motionless under a sky gone hard and clear with the season's first real cold. She had not cried since the funeral. Not once, in 2 full years. Not at the reading of the will. Not when she found Thomas's boots still by the door 6 months later and finally understood she'd never move them. Not even on the loneliest nights when the farmhouse felt less like a home and more like a museum built around an absence. She did not cry that night either. But something in her chest had begun, slowly, to loosen, the way frozen ground loosens before a thaw, imperceptibly, and then all at once. Saturday morning arrived pale and windless, the kind of stillness that in that valley usually preceded weather. By 9 o'clock, trucks had begun lining the shoulder of the county road below Muriel's property, far more than the occasion strictly required. Warren Pettibone arrived precisely on schedule, accompanied by a second county evaluator, a stern, silver-haired man named Garrett Voss who had built a decades-long reputation on being unmoved by sentiment of any kind. Behind them, spread along the fence line and the low rise beyond it, perhaps 40 of Muriel's neighbors gathered to watch, drawn by curiosity, by concern, and in more cases than anyone would later admit, by the same appetite for someone else's failure that had filled the Brindle Creek bleachers a month before. Lyle Corrigan stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed, a posture of a man who had already decided how the morning would end. Dr. Anand's letter had been submitted in advance, and Garrett Voss acknowledged it with the flat courtesy of a man who had seen 100 such letters and trusted none of them more than the evidence in front of him. The test, he explained to Muriel in a brief private conference before it began, would require the horse to be haltered, led at a walk and a trot through a series of obstacles, and subjected to at least one unscheduled loud stimulus, a standard component of every evaluation, designed to reveal whether an animal's calm was genuine or merely the temporary absence of provocation. Muriel asked, carefully, whether the stimulus could be announced or delayed, even briefly, given the diagnosis in the letter. Voss's answer was courteous and immovable. The test existed precisely because animals behaved differently when they knew what was coming. There would be no exceptions. She walked back to the pen with that answer settled cold in her stomach, understanding exactly what it meant. Zephyr's deafness was not a flaw she could disclose her way around. It was the single variable the entire test had been designed to expose, and no amount of explanation would matter if the county's own procedure guaranteed the one scenario he could not yet survive without panic. The gate opened. Zephyr came through it more calmly than anyone but Muriel expected. His coat brushed to a deep, healthy black, his stride even, his ears, both of them, out of long habit, swiveling to track the unfamiliar crowd. A murmur ran through the onlookers, equal parts surprise and grudging approval. He walked the length of the obstacle course without incident. He trotted a wide circle at Muriel's shoulder, responsive to her voice. His attention locked on her in a way that made even Garrett Voss's stern expression soften by a fraction. For nearly 10 minutes, it looked, astonishingly, like the morning might end quietly, might end in Muriel's favor, might end with a signature on a form and a slow dispersal of disappointed spectators. Then, near the edge of the field, a farm truck idling in the parking area for the evaluation, driven, though no one would ever officially confirm it, by a young hand employed on Lyle Corrigan's ranch, backfired with a sound like a rifle shot cracking across the open ground. Every head in the crowd turned toward the sound. Zephyr's entire body seized in a single violent convulsion of terror, and because the sound had come from a direction his ruined ear could not properly place, his instinct did the only thing 11 years of untreated fear had ever taught him to do. He reared, screaming, and spun hard to his left, directly into his blind side, directly into the one position from which every threat in his life had always seemed to come from nowhere, and the lead rope tore instantly from Muriel's grip. The crowd surged backward. Someone shouted for everyone to clear the field. Warren Pettibone's hand went instinctively toward his radio, already composing, in his mind, the report that would end this animal's chances for good. Lyle Corrigan did not move, did not shout, only watched, his expression unreadable, as 1,700 pounds of panicked horse spun in tight, dangerous circles at the center of the field, hooves cutting furrows into the frost-hardened ground, close enough to the fence that two men scrambled backward to keep clear of it. And Muriel Ashworth, 62 years old, alone in the middle of that field, did not run. For one suspended second, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Warren Pettibone shouted her name, a warning more than a call, telling her to get clear, get back, get out of the way. But Muriel was already moving, and she was not moving away. She walked toward the horse's left side, the blind side, the one direction from which, for 11 years, every hand that reached for him had arrived as an ambush. Every sound had come without warning. Every touch had landed as a threat he never saw coming. It was the single most dangerous place a person could stand in front of a panicking half-ton animal, and it was exactly where she chose to go, her stride even, her arms loose at her sides, her whole body speaking a language of calm that her racing heart did not remotely share. Someone in the crowd screamed for her to stop. Lyle Corrigan, for the first time all morning, took a step forward, his composure finally cracking into something that might have been alarm, or might have been the beginning of regret. Garrett Voss's clipboard slipped from his hand and hit the ground unnoticed. Zephyr reared again as she closed the final distance, his forelegs cutting the air a body's length from where she stood, and in that instant, with the whole township watching from the fence line in horrified silence, Muriel did not flinch and did not retreat. She stepped directly beneath the arc of his motion, into the space his hooves would occupy on their way back down, and wrapped both arms around the base of his neck. The impact staggered her. His full weight came down half a breath later, his front hooves striking the earth on either side of her boots, close enough that the crowd's collective gasp was audible even over the horse's own ragged, terrified breathing. And then, with her face pressed against the damp heat of his neck, her arms locked around him with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond her 62 years, Muriel Ashworth opened her mouth and screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It came out high and sharp and impossibly sustained. A single unbroken note that cut through the panic and the murmuring crowd and the fading echo of the truck's backfire, pitched precisely into the register that Dr. Anand had noted. almost as an afterthought. During her examination 3 weeks earlier, the narrow band of frequency that Zephyr's one working ear could still register clearly, cutting through even his own frantic breathing. It was also, unmistakably, more than a signal. It carried in it 2 years of silence. Every unspoken word since a tractor idled too long in a frost-covered field. Every night, she had sat outside a round pen reading a dead man's handwriting instead of speaking her own grief aloud. Every insult disguised as concern that Lyle Corrigan had delivered at her fence line. Every whispered judgment traded across a grocery store aisle. It was grief and fury and love, indistinguishable from one another, released all at once into a field gone completely silent except for the sound of her voice and the ragged breath of the animal in her arms. Zephyr went still. It happened all at once, and yet seemed to unfold slowly enough for every person at that fence line to witness each individual second of it. The wild tension draining out of his enormous frame, his ears, both of them, swiveling fully toward the sound of her voice, his forelegs settling, his great head lowering by degrees until it came to rest against her collarbone. And then, in a motion that made the entire crowd take an audible, involuntary step backward, his front knees folded, and he lowered his whole body down into the frost-bitten grass, kneeling, his head sinking into Muriel's lap as she sank down with him, both of them collapsing into the same small space of ground, the horse's massive skull cradled against a woman who had just, in front of the entire township, screamed out 2 years of unspoken sorrow and been answered with total surrender. The silence that followed lasted long enough that several people would later swear it had gone on for a full minute, though Warren Pettibone's own account, given later to the county board, put it closer to 8 or 9 seconds. It was long enough, regardless, for the crowd to genuinely believe, for one terrible stretch of held breath, that something irreversible had happened, that the scream they'd heard was a woman being hurt, not a woman finally letting go. Then Muriel's shoulders began to shake, and it became clear, even from the fence line, that she was crying, fully, openly, without the careful containment she'd maintained through 2 years of Thursday grocery trips and church parking lots and quiet nods that gave nothing away. She cried with her face pressed against the horse's cheek and her hands buried in his mane, and Zephyr did not move, did not startle, only knelt there in the frost with his eyes half closed, absorbing the sound of a grief he seemed, in some wordless animal way, to recognize as akin to his own. Nobody at that fence line spoke. Nobody moved to intervene, while Corrigan stood with his jaw tight and his hands loose at his sides, watching a scene he had engineered every circumstance to produce, except for the ending. Garrett Voss was the first to move, crossing the field slowly, his stern face unreadable, and crouching a careful distance from the kneeling horse to observe without disturbing. He watched for a long moment. The animal's utter stillness, the trust in the angle of that lowered head, the complete absence of the aggression his entire career had trained him to expect from a horse with this reputation. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the flat officiousness it carried at the start of the morning. He asked, quietly, whether the diagnosis in Dr. Anand's letter was the reason for the direction Muriel had approached from. Muriel, still on her knees in the frost with Zephyr's head heavy in her lap, answered without lifting her eyes. She said that the horse wasn't dangerous. He was deaf on one side, and every person who'd ever handled him had mistaken his fear for madness and struck him for it, until fear was the only language left for him to speak. Voss was quiet for a long moment, studying the animal's utterly relaxed posture, the total absence of threat in a creature the county's own file described as unmanageable. Then he reached for his clipboard, retrieved from the ground where it had fallen, and began writing. Lyle Corrigan found his voice before Voss finished writing, though it came out with less certainty than it had carried all month. He said, loud enough for the fence line to hear, that this proved nothing, that the horse had been coached or drugged, or that Muriel had staged the entire collapse to win sympathy from a crowd that had already gathered to watch her fail. He said the word trick and looked around for support, and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that the crowd's attention had shifted entirely away from him. Garrett Voss did not look up from his clipboard right away. When he finally did, his expression carried the particular weariness of a man who had spent 30 years watching people try to argue with what was directly in front of them. He said, evenly, that he had personally witnessed a stallion with a documented history of violent unpredictability kneel voluntarily in an open field after a woman walked, unarmed and unprotected, into the single position every training manual would tell her to avoid, and that whatever theory Lyle wanted to construct around that, it would need to explain why the horse had not, in fact, harmed her. The silence that answered him was its own verdict. Voss finished his notes standing in the frost-damp grass, his pen moving without hesitation now, and read the determination aloud to the gathered crowd in the flat, procedural language the county required, that the animal identified as Zephyr, upon full evaluation, demonstrated sound temperament under owner handling, that the previously documented aggressive incidents were consistent with an untreated auditory impairment rather than inherent danger, and that custody would remain effective. Immediately, and without further review, with Muriel Ashworth, he signed the form on the hood of his own truck, in full view of the assembled township, and handed the carbon copy to Muriel with a nod that carried more respect than any words he might have chosen instead. The crowd began to disperse slowly, in twos and threes, the earlier murmuring replaced now by something quieter and harder to name. Not quite an apology, since almost none of them would have called it that, but a visible recalibration, the particular discomfort of people realizing they'd spent a month laughing at something they hadn't understood. Daniel Fenwick lingered longest, standing at the fence with his cap in his hands, and before he turned to leave he told Muriel, in a voice gone rough with something unspoken, that he was glad she hadn't listened to any of them. While Corrigan left without another word, his truck door slamming hard enough to be heard across the field, and though he would remain her neighbor for years afterward, he never again mentioned the West 40, and he never again brought a county form to her door. Muriel stayed in the field long after the last truck pulled away, sitting in the frost with Zephyr's head still resting in her lap, running her hand along the ridge of his neck in slow, unhurried strokes. The winter light had begun to shift toward afternoon, gold and low across the hollow, and for the first time in 2 years, the particular ache she carried everywhere, into the kitchen, into the empty side of the bed, into every Thursday grocery aisle, sat a little differently in her chest. Not gone, nothing that large, simply left, but loosened, the way a knot loosens once someone finally finds the right thread to pull. The following spring, the orchard bloomed more fully than it had in years. Muriel could not have explained the connection to anyone who asked, and several people did ask, in the particular tone of a community trying to make sense of a story it had gotten badly wrong the first time. She simply noted that she'd had more reason to be out among the trees that year, pruning, grafting, clearing the deadwood Thomas had left unfinished, because the mornings no longer began with silence stretched taut across an empty kitchen. They began instead with the sound of hooves against packed earth, a horse waiting at the pasture gate, ears swiveling toward the creak of the porch door. Zephyr never fully lost his wariness on the left. Dr. Anand had been honest about that from the beginning. Deafness does not heal, and an animal's instincts, once carved so deeply by years of mishandling, do not vanish simply because the mishandling stops. He still startled, occasionally, at sounds that arrived from that blind angle. He still required, for the rest of his life, that anyone approaching him from the left do so with visible movement first, a hand raised into his field of vision, a moment allowed for recognition before contact. Muriel taught this, patiently, to the small handful of people who eventually earned enough trust to handle him at all. Daniel Fenwick, mostly, who took to visiting on weekends and had, by the following autumn, become something less awkward to call a friend. The orchard slowly came back to something resembling its old productivity, not through any transformation as dramatic as the one that had unfolded in that field, but through the same patient, unglamorous accumulation of small efforts that had carried Muriel through the weeks with Zephyr, one prune branch, one grafted scion, one morning at a time. She sold apples again that fall, not in the volume Thomas once had, but enough to matter, enough to feel, for the first time in 2 years, like the land was hers to tend rather than simply hers to survive. She still read aloud in the evenings, though less from grief now and more from something closer to habit turned companionship. She had worked her way through nearly every journal Thomas left behind, and had begun, without quite announcing it to herself, keeping a new one of her own, notes on grafting, notes on the weather, and here and there, tucked between the practical entries, Small private observations about a horse who had taught her that the loudest kind of healing sometimes arrives disguised as the thing everyone else has already given up on. Aldermont Hollow's memory of that October morning softened over time into something closer to legend than gossip, the kind of story told at church socials with a note of local pride rather than mockery. The widow and the deaf stallion. The scream heard across 3 properties. The county evaluator who tore up his own preconceptions on the spot. Few people who repeated it understood the full weight of what it had cost her to walk into that field, or what it had taken, after 2 years of careful silence, to let a sound that large finally leave her body in front of everyone she knew. But those who had stood at that fence line never quite forgot the sight of it. A woman kneeling in the frost, her face pressed against the neck of an animal the whole valley had called broken, both of them finally still. Muriel Ashworth is 70 now. The orchard still stands on the eastern ridge above Aldermont Hollow. Its rows a little wilder than they were in Thomas's day, but bearing fruit every autumn all the same. Zephyr still meets her at the gate each morning, older now himself, his black coat gone silver at the muzzle, his blind side still requiring the same patient care it always did. Nobody in that valley calls him broken anymore. They never had the right to in the first place. Some say the truest things in life arrive first as something everyone else has already thrown away. A horse, a grief, a woman the world had quietly stopped expecting anything from. What looked, for one October morning, like the end of a foolish old woman's last mistake turned out instead to be the sound of 2 lives finding, in each other, the one thing neither had been able to find alone. A reason to stop bracing for the next blow, and simply be still. If this story found you tonight, tell us where you're watching from. Somewhere out there, someone needed to hear it.